Hi, I'm Gloria Redlich, and have the pleasure of sitting outside at the beautiful Island Free Library. We do have some background noises that are just part of the atmosphere here, and we apologize if they interrupt, but they're part of the scene of people getting back to work. Um, we're here today. As most people know, today is Bloomsday, and we're celebrating, as people around, Joyce lovers around the world are celebrating his remarkable novel, Ulysses, and particularly celebrating the nature of the character that he created in Leopold Bloom. Um, uh, we've it's been fascinating for me to enter or re-enter the world according to Joyce through the portals of Ulysses, and of course, any excuse to read Joyce and to discuss him is great fun for me, and it's exactly why we're here, to lend our voices to the passages of this great novel. I personally have been in love with James Joyce since I was a graduate student in the 1970s at the University of Bridgeport. And though I had discovered a portrait of the artist as a young man earlier while an undergraduate, um, I, um, I found myself that I was drawn to the stream of consciousness which characterizes actually both novels, Portrait and, of course, Ulysses. I'm drawn to that capacity in Joyce of reflecting to us our inner selves at the very moment he sees us walking through the world or follows us walking through the world. So it's that inner consciousness at the same moment as our outer consciousness. My introduction to Ulysses was pretty much on the floor of a laundromat. We lived in Brookfield, Connecticut. I was at school doing graduate work and studying Irish literature, and we had a lot of laundry to do. We had 3 kids, and our washer kept breaking down. So much of my reading took place on the floor of that laundromat with this amazing novel propped on my knees, and in what became the beginning, the first of many, many readings. I can't tell you how many times I've gone back, delighted to go back through the pages of what is basically Ulysses' Odyssey. Most of you probably know that it was structured on Homer's Odyssey, and it's his very own Ulysses as the Odyssey for Bloom and for Stephen. We bring the 2 characters together. On Island, we've been celebrating Bloomsday for at least a decade, and bringing lots of Joyce and literature lovers together to share moments of our readings, add our voices to the readings of this incredible book. Before I actually talk about the text itself, I was drawn to, and I recently found a letter of Joyce's to Bennett Cerf, who was the publisher of Random House, which was the first publisher, Joyce's first American publisher. The letter is dated April 2nd, 1932, and I'd like to share some parts of it with you. In the letter, Joyce reviews some of the history of the censorship of his books. He refers to Dubliners, the extraordinary collection of short stories, all based in Dublin, that Joyce has given us. He says, that is, Joyce says, it was rejected no less than by 22 publishers, that is, Dubliners was. And when at last it was printed, some very kind person brought out the entire edition and had it burnt in Dublin, a new and private auto de fe. Of the publication of Ulysses, he adds, it was largely accomplished through the efforts of Sylvia Beach, who was owner and of a small English bookshop and lending library in Paris that was known as Shakespeare and Company. Of Beach, he says, This brave woman, who risked what professional publishers did not wish to, took the manuscript and simply handed it to a printer. So it was, he says, Ulysses came out a very short time after it had been delivered, and the first printed copy was sent to me, meaning to Joyce, for his 40th birthday on the 2nd of February, 1922. The story of the novel's acceptance in the United States involved Surf and Random House, something this I hadn't known until looking into it recently. Surf and Random House arranged for it to be seized in order to force it into a court hearing. They mailed it, and the book was seized by United States authorities and resulted in a court ruling by Judge John Woolsey, which was historic, and under which the censorship in the United States was lifted. Interestingly to me, as a Joyce student and an Irish Lit student, I had a professor, William Windsor, who had studied Joyce and Irish literature at Columbia University. And he described the way he first read Ulysses. He said there was only one copy in the whole university, and it was chained to a lectern in the university library. And he stood, as other students did, they signed up for an hour, and they stood reading Ulysses an hour at a time. For me, later it was Dr. Windsor who introduced me. I brought with me my 2 copies. They come with me because to give me moral support. One is my very used copy of Ulysses, from which I'm not reading because I'm afraid the pages will blow away. And the other is my copy of Finnegan's Wake, which I spent many, many years poring over, struggling with stuff and reading with a fellow student, and this Dr. Windsor, who is gracious and kind and generous enough to spend 2.5 years with me studying, studying Joyce's final work, Finnegan's Wake. Now, personally, as I re-enter Ulysses, this time I'm struck. It's maybe the 5th or 6th rereading for me, and I'm struck by something that's very topical for me, for us today. I think very relevant to what we're experiencing in our society now in the 21st century. I speak of bigotry. The bigotry that has led us at this moment to declare that Black Lives Matter, as though this is something we are just discovering. It is a statement that startles in its fundamental and obvious truth. Don't we all know where hatred leads us? Today we are brought up short, not always knowing, perhaps not caring to know or to take measure of bigotry, of hatred of the other. But Joyce knew. He knew, and he documents in the form of a deep-rooted Jew hatred that spread its tentacles throughout Ireland and Europe, describing it as it spills out over and onto the streets of Dublin. Leopold Bloom, whom we celebrate today, is thought to be a Jew, and even thinks of himself as a Jew, although his mother was not Jewish. His father was a Hungarian Jew. The reason that this is important, or this history of family, is that according to Jewish law, an individual is not truly Jewish unless their mother is Jewish. Though I've read this book before, as I've said so many times, I'm once again startled by this overt Jew hatred, or what we today call anti-Semitism. It's so obviously and deliberately a thread in Ulysses. And for me, at this time, it reflects a kind of pervasiveness and depth of racial hatred that we have come to see in our very own country. In the first section of Ulysses, the Telemachus section, I should remind everyone that Joyce structured his work on Homer's Great Odyssey, and the sections of the book are titled for Homer's, with Homer's title. So the very first is Telemachus, who is Odysseus' son, and in this case, it's Stephen Dedalus, who is the son, the spiritual son, if you will, of Bloom. In Telemachus section, we are introduced to Stephen Dedalus, who we will discover searching for his own identity, a young man searching and seeming to search for a spiritual father. At the same time, we come close as we look at Bloom in the 3rd chapter. We learn that Bloom is searching for his son, Rudy, who had died 11 days after birth and has left Leopold emotionally devastated and emasculated. We also learn that consequently he and Molly have not had sex for 11 years. In this first section, the Telemachus section, there's a scene where Stephen walks along with a visitor, Haynes, who is trying to impress Stephen, but he entirely misreads him. Haynes has come to stay with Buck Mulligan and Stephen, who live in Martello Tower. Haynes says to Stephen, "Of course, I'm a Britisher. I don't want to see my country fall into the hands of German Jews either. That's our national problem, I'm afraid, right now." Stephen doesn't respond to him. He's disgusted by Haynes, as we had learned earlier in reading the opening of the novel. And we hear Stephen, as he walks away from Haynes, he abruptly walks away from him, muttering and promising to himself, "I will not sleep here tonight." We follow Stephen as he rambles on towards the school where he teaches young boys arithmetic and history. Mr. Deasy is the headmaster. What we pick up at the exchange between these two, Mr. Deasy and Stephen. Mr. Deasy addresses Stephen and says, "Mark my words, Mr. Dedalus. England is in the hands of the Jews in all the highest places, her finance, her press, and they are signs of a nation's decay. Wherever they gather, they eat up the nation's vital energy. I've seen it coming for years. Jew merchants are already at their work of destruction. Old England's dying." Stephen refutes him. A merchant is one who buys cheap and sells dear. Jew or Gentile, is it not? Is he not? But Deasy does not respond to Stephen's words. He simply continues listening to this agenda that has internalized his own vision of Jews. "They sinned against the light," he says, "and you can see the darkness in their eyes, and that is why they are wanderers on the earth to this day." Stephen says, "Who has not?" "Deasy, what do you mean?" "Stephen, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." Deasy says, "All history moves toward one great goal, the manifestation of God." Stephen, pointing to the window, says, "That is God," jerking his thumb. Deasy asks, "What?" Stephen, "A shout in the street." I, a reader, ask, is the shout one of the children laughing and playing, or a cry of distress and of need? Perhaps it's both. Deasy never really hears or understands Stephen. He says to him, "Mr. Dedalus, I just want to say, Ireland, they say, has had the honor of being the only country which never persecuted the Jews. Do you know why?" And gleefully, before Stephen can answer, he answers his own question. because she never let them in. When the next scene, we see Stephen leaving the school, and we feel with him his sense of loss, a sense of searching for something. He's lost a young lover, we learn. He's torn by guilt over not having prayed with his mother as she lay dying. We know he cannot turn to his biological father, who's an alcoholic and continually in debt, and who hasn't taken care of either his children or his wife. And this is where we begin to feel or sense Stephen's search for a spiritual guidance and or a spiritual father. And it's at this moment that we are introduced to Bloom at home. What we discover in Bloom is a sort of bumbling nice guy, devotedly preparing breakfast for his wife, bringing it to her in bed, also bringing in the mail, a postcard from Millie, their daughter, who lives away, and a letter which he knows is from Ulysses Boylan, Molly's lover. He even asks her when Boylan is coming, when he is due. She tells him 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that he's bringing the score of an opera, which they will sing together. Bloom sees her look in the mirror at herself and understands that she's grown uncertain of her own beauty and of her growing older. He knows her assignation with Boylan is in part about reassuring her. He understands her in spite of his deep jealousy. All day, Bloom is haunted by the knowledge of Molly's meeting with Boylan in the afternoon. Wherever he is, he watches the clock all day. As we follow him, as we follow Bloom, we learn of his deep love for Molly, but it's side by side with a thread of deep, deep grief for the loss of Rudy. He misses Millie, who is living away as well, but we also learn that Bloom is involved in a little flirtation with a woman with whom he corresponds. In the course, then, of this very ordinary day, we discover him acting out of concern for others, paying his respects at a funeral, initiating a collection for a family left penniless by the death of their father and husband, visiting a friend who is in labor in the hospital. In the words of critic Morton Levitt, Bloom is kind, decent, principled, interested in others and in ideas, even an idealist. He is profoundly human. It is this man that we see in the later encounter in a pub with the character known as the Citizen. The Citizen is the counterpart of Homer's Cyclops, the one-eyed giant called Polyphemus, with whom Ulysses, Odysseus has an incredible encounter. In the pub, the modern-day Cyclops, or the Citizen, and Bloom, along with several hangers-on in the pub, have the following exchange. Bloom: persecution. All the history is full of it, perpetrating national hatred among nations. John Joyce: do you know what a nation means? Bloom: a nation is the same people living in the same place. Citizen: and what is your nation? Bloom: Ireland. I was born in Ireland. And then he adds, and I belong to a race too that is hated and persecuted. Also now, at this very minute, this very instant, robbed, plundered, insulted, persecuted, taking what belongs to us by right. At this very moment, sold by auction, off in Morocco, like slaves or cattle. Citizen: are you talking about the New Jerusalem? Bloom: I'm talking about injustice. But it's no use. Force, hatred, history, all that. That's not life for men and women. Insult and hatred. And everybody knows that. It's the very opposite of that which is really life. What? Says Alf. Bloom says, love. I mean the opposite of hatred. Love. When Bloom leaves the pub for a few minutes, the hatred of the citizen and the others in the pub bubbles up. Ned, is he a Jew or a Gentile? Martin, he's a perverted Jew from a place in Hungary. Citizen, that's the new Messiah for Ireland. Martin, well, they're still looking for their Redeemer. And then Bloom returns to the pub. It doesn't take long before the citizen builds to this great anger and shouting obscenities at Bloom, chases him out the door, threatening to throw a biscuit tin at him, which he actually does throw, to which, as he's flying out the door, Bloom responds, Mendelssohn was a Jew, and Karl Marx, and Spinoza, and the Savior was a Jew, and his father was a Jew. You're God. When someone corrects him about the father, he says, okay, well, his uncle was a Jew. Your God was a Jew. Christ was a Jew like me. Citizen is furious. By Jesus, I'll brain that bloody Jew man for using the holy name. By Jesus, I'll crucify him, so I will. Give us the biscuit box. Later, in a quiet moment, Bloom describes the scene with the Cyclops, with the citizen, this angry, bigoted man. He called me a Jew, and in a heated fashion, offensively. So I, without deviating from plain facts in the least, told him his God, I mean Christ, was a Jew too, and all his family like me, though in reality I'm not sure. I'm not one. And actually he's referring to the fact that not literally is he himself a Jew. Then he says about the Cyclops, about the citizen, that was one for him. A soft answer turns away wrath. And here we have a bit of the sort of unique flavor of Bloom's character. Levitt, the critic that I referred to, talks about him as rational, defensive, and unintentionally comic. Bloom later describes himself and describes what he stands for. He says, I stand for the reform of municipal morals and the plain 10 commandments. New worlds for old, union of all, Jew, Muslim, Gentile. 3 acres and a cow for all children of nature. All parks open for the public, day and night. Electric dish scrubbers. Remember that Bloom does the dishes. Electric, he uses advanced on dishwashers. He says tuberculosis, lunacy, war, and mendicancy, the state of being a beggar, must all cease. General amnesty, weekly carnival with mass license, bonuses for all, Esperanto, the universal language, with universal brotherhood. Free money, free rent, free love, and a free lay church in a free lay state. This is what Bloom stands for. Again, Levitt says the humor, the irony, the idealism manage in Bloom to coexist very easily. We come to respect Bloom even as we're chuckling at him. Bloom has also been described as the archetypal modernist figure, the man whose history, attitude, condition came to represent all of humanity in the 20th century. As I've been rereading these passages about the anti-Semitism in Joyce, in the context of what we're experiencing today, I am reminded that hatred anywhere generates hatred everywhere. That hatred distorts the human experience, how we see or don't see each other, how we treat each other, and how much it undermines our very humanity. I am also reminded by Joyce how art and the artists give each of us a mirror into the limitations and capacities of our individual souls and our common humanity. Art makes us hope and makes us believe in the possibility that we can all be better.